Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ika Vat. As two EU leaders urge China to bring peace to Ukraine and Beijing conducts military drills following President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with Kevin McCarthy, we ask whether China has what it takes to be a global peacemaker. With me to discuss this are Ching-long Lu, former representative to France and former representative to Haiti, Alexander Huang, Kuomintang International Affairs Director and representative to the US, and Stephen Tan, International Policy Advisory Group Managing Director. Ambassador Alexander and Stephen, a very warm welcome to the show today.
Yes.
But first, Chinese planes and ships still circle close to Taiwan, though 3 days of military drills by China have ended. The PLA claims they were simulating attacks on or blockading Taiwan. Bing Wang and Andy Xue report.
In this video from Taiwan's Coast Guard, a tense exchange between them and a Chinese military vessel. This comes amid a 3-day military exercise announced by China that began on Saturday. It involves air, land, and sea forces encircling Taiwan. China is flexing its military muscle after Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen and U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy held high-level talks in California last week.
I think for China, it's a propaganda piece for their internal population.
Taiwan's defense ministry says they are increasing their combat readiness in case of escalation.
PLA's recent harassment with their assets has destabilized the region. This time, President Tsai's visit became their excuse to conduct exercises, and their actions have severely jeopardized the security of the surrounding region.
中国围台军演，那么只会让全世界看到，它是和平的破坏者，维护台海的和平跟稳定，确保台湾的安全，这是全世界民主国家的共同利益。
But despite the military posturing, on the streets of Taipei, life goes on.
当然，现在也不完全觉得这次的演习就会对我们有安全上的疑虑，或者是，可是其实他们做的每一个动作都是在 push 这个界限。
Alexander, in a 24-hour period, we've had more than 90 planes, 12 ships close to Taiwan. So what happened to the muted response?
I think this exercise had been pretty unique because through previous experience, China used to announce a specific area with coordinates, but this time they did not. They just said east, north, west.
What's behind that, do you think?
I think they are trying different tactics or strategic image. Number two, for a specific reason that they did not disrupt these civil aviation and the commercial shipping lanes this time. And thirdly, I think this time is pretty unique because this has been the first time that an aircraft carrier had participated in the drill, and the carrier-borne fighter jet had involved in this exercise. And lastly, I would say this time also set the record that they have sent near Taiwan 232 sorties within 3 days that encircling Taiwan. I think even though we do not see a ballistic missile firing, but I think the intensity is pretty high.
Stephen, if I can ask you, so, following Nancy Pelosi's trip, global leaders said that the response from China, the military drills, was irresponsible, was destabilizing. And that changed, as people said, changed the status quo in that it established a new norm, kind of, going over the median line, which is the unofficial boundary that separates China from Taiwan. So, given the records that Alexander, the differences, the escalations that Alexander has mentioned, what do you think is happening this time?
Well, I think a lot of people say that this time the exercise or the military drills have been toned down by China for a reason or two. But again, I think time and again China is gradually, but very specifically, changed the status quo of the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. And I think the world should notice that it is China that changed the status quo by various military ways and other means of coercion, step by step, with the use of this event or that event as an excuse. But we should know that China is pushing hard anyway, regardless of the occurrence of a particular event or not. I think this is happening as we see it. Whether or not it's an escalated or it's a toned down approach, we see for the past 3 days, it's, I mean, to me and to many analysts in the world, that it is not a toned down approach. I would argue that it is an escalation.
And what do you expect next? Because they announced 3 days,
Right.
they're still there.
What
do you expect next?
We'll see how it goes. Although China reportedly announced the closure of the 3-day drill, but we don't know what's going to be the next. Because it is happening anytime, and any event, any current event will be used and utilized by the PLA to trigger another drill or exercise.
Ambassador, I want to bring up a statement from the AIT. It was a statement to Reuters. It says the United States was monitoring China's drills around Taiwan closely and is comfortable and confident it has sufficient resources and capabilities regionally to ensure peace and stability. Tell me, what does this mean?
Well, I just, during last several days, I have received several calls from friends. My friends over there, they are concerned about this situation. But if today we see the so-called official language given by the AIT, comfortable and confident. Comfortable for me, that means you can continue to enjoy your normal life. So in the supermarket, everywhere, the life continues, number one. And secondly, if it's said confident, that means self-control from both sides, even from the American side, or under, let's say, programmed. That means China won't stop their intimidation on Taiwan, and Taiwanese people is familiar with such kind of so-called piece of theater. This is interesting as an observer can share.
Yes, and Alexander talked about Ambassador talked about the intimidation and what you were saying about not giving exact coordinates, a different tactic, maybe to sow confusion for Taiwan, for Taiwan's defenses. So they're trying out different tactics.
Yeah, if they do not specify a location or area, it will not send the alert to civilian aviation. And so people would not get panic, I mean, surrounding Taiwan.
Right.
But
so are they trying to intimidate, or are they not?
They intimidate Taiwan rather than a overt approach. I think they are more covert, more opaque this time. But it does not mean that it did not escalate. They did not add, programs and items in their drills. So we need to be very vigilant.
And what's your view? Do you share Ambassador's view that in Taiwan, this intimidation is not working?
Yeah, we can say that in a sense. But still, I believe that social endurance needs to be practiced. If the people does not have sufficient information about the seriousness of the PLA intimidation, when one is not intimidated, it doesn't mean that he is or her is not in danger. So I think we have a lot of work to do to prepare the whole society to understand that what's going on surrounding Taiwan.
Stephen, I mean, you mentioned, it's essential to have peace and stability, especially in the Taiwan Strait. Both the US and the EU have reacted to China's military action by asking them to show restraint, to refrain from unilaterally changing the status quo. Now, of course, a lot of the relationships that the West has built with China, with the PRC, is based on this kind of agreement, if we can show it up on screen. So let's take a look at the Taiwan Relations Act, the wording there. It says, it is the policy of the United States to make clear that the US decision to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. And it goes on to say to consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means, i.e. boycotts, embargoes, maybe blockades, a threat to peace. It would be a threat to peace and stability. So, Stephen, you're a lawyer. Tell me, if that basis of peaceful means is removed, where does that leave those relationships?
Well, absolutely. It's imperative that we know that the language specifically set forth in the Taiwan Relations Act, having the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait and the use of the peaceful means, meaning that it's nothing military or other means of coercion, as a premises for recognizing or having a diplomatic relationship between the United States and China, and keeping as it is based on the Taiwan Relations Act. But I think that peace and stability and use of the peaceful means have long been eroded over time unilaterally by China, and that the change of the status quo by nature is critically important, I believe, in analyzing how the United States, how the Congress of the United States is applying or adapting the Taiwan Relations Act, and how to view the relationship between the United States and China, and how to fortify the substantive, although non-diplomatic, relationship with Taiwan.
Are you saying that it should adapt as
I think China's unilateral change of the status quo should be factored in, and is being factored in as we speak by the congressmen, by people on the Hill in the United States, and also the rest of the world. I think we should take a note on that, that the unilateral change of the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait is a critical factor in analyzing and adjusting or readjusting and repositioning the relationship with China. This doesn't just apply to the United States, but also the rest of the world with China.
Alexander, let's take a look now at the misinformation or propaganda surrounding the military action. I just want to quote what China's Eastern Theater Command said in a statement. It said it had comprehensively tested the capability of multiple units under actual combat conditions. The troops are ready to fight all the time, can fight at any time, resolutely crushing any form of Taiwan independence and separatism and foreign interference. So, you talked about a change in tactics in terms of not having the exact coordinates. Has there been a change, you think, in tactics in terms of disinformation, propaganda?
Yeah, I would put it in different layers. I think on the surface they did send out footage, films, or statement that may not be true. For instance, using vague terminology, or
what terminology?
Like exploit all possible tactics. What are they? What kind of tactics? Which force? Rocket force? Navy? Air Force? So they gave out a kind of general vague description and make people fear. That's one account. The other one is that I think we have witnessed less live fire shooting, but a lot of maneuvering as well. So what have been hidden? What we don't know? You know, as a veteran observer of the People's Liberation Army for more than 30 years, I would say that I would personally take a more cautious view on their statement. You know, I may not be fooled by their propaganda, but I will take everything seriously, and I will try to find evidence to prove right or wrong in their statement. So we need time to verify these.
What is the aim behind words such as encirclement? Because this was picked up on social media and it was criticized because it was saying that this in fact was not an encirclement of Taiwan. What's the aim behind using language?
You know, we try to be very precise about the specific terms. Encirclement.
And this was from the PLA themselves.
Right. And so I use that term as well. But encirclement, it does not mean full blockade surrounding Taiwan. And it might be a description about a partial blockade. But for the drills that we witnessed for the past 3 days, it does not come up, you know, fit in the category of partial blockade. So that's the area, a gray area that we need to find out what exactly that they have practiced. Because we are not in the government, I was not able to have the access to look at the screen in the high command all the time. So I would say that for government and for people who watch this closely, should work together and try to learn carefully about every exercises and try to analyze, you know, what have been changed and what does it mean for us.
Stephen, can I ask you then, so in terms of, you know, what Alexander said, since it has grown in its military power, is that there's no point in fighting because, you know, the invasion or an attack will be over in just a couple of days. So is this a variant of that, where they?
Well, I think the drills for the past 3 days, not just a military exercise per se, but it's also an information warfare. Then you see the Chinese propaganda see collaborations with certain media outlets or certain folks on the ground to see how to interpret the 3-day military drills. And I think how to understand the impact and significance of the drill and you know, what the next steps be are very important. And I think this is a information/disinformation warfare that is going on right now that I think China purposely is trying to establish something that to intimidate, emphasize, and overly emphasize the significance of these drills to the extent that, just like Alexander just correctly pointed out, that it's an encirclement, but you know, I think China is trying to create an illusion that is similar to or to the same effect of an actual blockade or a semi-blockade. So I think that's information warfare, and that is a psychological warfare as well
against the Taiwanese people.
Against the people in Taiwan and the rest of the world. So how to rightfully and correctly understand and analyze the impact and exactly what it is for the past 2 days.
And try not to participate in it in terms of global media.
That's right, that's right.
Now, European leaders have been going to Beijing in succession. The very latest French President Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, following the Spanish and German leaders earlier. James Chater and Alex Chen report.
Words of welcome from Chinese President Xi Jinping to Presidents Macron of France and von der Leyen of the European Commission.
Thanking you for hosting us here in Beijing.
The two are the latest European leaders to visit China for talks. Top of their agenda, asking Xi to wield his influence over Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine, now into its second year. China last month unveiled a peace plan for the conflict, but Xi was criticized for not speaking with Ukraine's leaders. After their meeting, von der Leyen said the Chinese president was willing to call his Ukrainian counterpart.
We also count on China not to provide any military equipment directly or indirectly to Russia.
Von der Leyen said they also spoke to Xi about Taiwan, which China claims as part of its territory. Peace in the Taiwan Strait, she said, was of, quote, paramount importance.
The threat to, or the use of force to change the status quo is unacceptable.
The EU leaders' visit comes as concerns over China mount in the bloc, especially over deepening economic dependencies on Beijing. In recent years, the EU's goods trade deficit with China has widened from 145 billion euros in 2016 to 396 billion euros in 2022, around 432 billion US dollars.
支持欧洲实现战略自主，坚持中欧关系不针对、不依附、也不受制于第三方。
French President Macron said Europe didn't want to decouple completely from China's economy.
Ce n'est pas une approche anti-chinoise, c'est une approche pro-européenne. Et je pense que nous, Européens, on veut faire du commerce avec vous en respectant le fait que le président de la Chine a d'abord des déterminants pro-chinois.
Hello, I'm Ian Kavat of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. Now, toward the end of Macron's trip, he gave interviews to media on his plane, making some controversial comments. Here's the reaction of US Senator Marco Rubio.
Here's what he told the reporters. He told the reporters, number one, that it's time for Europe to break away from the United States, not to depend on the dollar, not to depend so much on us, to become their own third superpower. The second thing he says, which I found really interesting, was that Europe needs to make sure that they don't get involved in conflicts that are not their conflicts. Specifically, that Europe should not be picking sides on Taiwan between the United States and China. And so I think this is a good moment for us to ask Europe, does Macron speak for all of Europe? Is Macron now the head of Europe? Is he now the most powerful leader in Europe? Because if he is, then there's some things we're going to need to change. Number one, you know, Europe, including France specifically, has depended heavily on the United States for 70 years for their own defense. In fact, when Macron tried to play global superpower and send troops to North Africa to fight terrorists, he couldn't even get his own troops there. We had to fly them there, and we had to fly them back. He couldn't even get his own troops there. So if they're going to break off on their own and follow Macron's lead, that's going to save us a lot of money. As far as not getting involved in other conflicts that are not ours, we need to ask Europe, does he speak for them? Because we're pretty heavily involved in Ukraine right now. We're spending a lot of our taxpayer money on a European war. And I've supported that because I think it's in the national interest of the United States to be allies to our allies.
Ambassador, can I ask you, does Macron speak for Europe?
The French people, they know the reason that Macron couldn't do something concretely. But it was not, the negative element in front of the presidential election. And now we can see very clearly that traditionally speaking, the French people, they do have their so-called historical or cultural convictions. That means we must be very useful. We must try to do something good for the people because on the universal French value, let's say freedom, liberty, and fraternity. So we should try to improve the quality of life, even in favor of the people who were under a condition not like we French people enjoy.
France in Europe, Alexander, to the transatlantic partnership. Rubio obviously voices some genuine concerns there. What are the ramifications of Macron's comments and Macron's visit?
I think Macron's comments would bring back mixed reactions from different countries. Because I know France is unique and they have their own tradition, and Macron got pretty much full in his play in domestic politics. And he has already successfully bring back a lot of contracts from dealing with China. For politicians, I think it's a kind of pre-campaign arrangement. But I do not find his remarks appropriate.
Yes, because I guess the question is, and what Rubio is asking is the US not an ally of France, of the EU? do you not share our values? Because that seems to be, maybe I can move to Stephen, that seems to be what Macron is saying. He's talking about putting distance between the EU and the US. He's talking about a third way, being a third pole, so that the EU can be a sort of third superpower.
Right. This is what is referred to as strategic autonomy. But to be honest, I don't really understand what that term means, because each sovereign state has its own autonomy in making its foreign policy based on its national interest, no doubt about that. But when you refer to that term as strategic autonomy, as if you are not autonomous, and this is the strangest thing out of the mouth of the president of a country. I think, Mr. President Macron, you're absolutely wrong in referring to the fact that Taiwan, or the issues on Taiwan, is not a problem of Europe or France. This is absolutely wrong. It's just like in the United States, when the war happens in Ukraine, it is the problem for everyone, every country, not just in Europe, not just in Eurasia. Same thing, what's going on in Indo-Pacific. What's going to happen in Taiwan Strait? What's going to happen for the 23 million people in Taiwan are the problem of the whole world, including France, including the EU. I understand that when President Macron say that, a lot of disagreement, even in France itself. A lot of people, a lot of congressional leaders, parliamentary leaders, thought leaders are totally in disagreement with their president in making the remarks as such. And then Wall Street Journal's Senator Rubio from the United States also speak for themselves. And I think the whole world is debating on his remarks.
Absolutely. And European Commission President von der Leyen and also Vice President Joseph Borrell have said many times that they don't blindly follow the US. It's because they actually agree with their values. If China has both, okay, so there is the understanding that Europe cannot cut off its ties to China because it is doing that with Russia. So there are people who have said, in fact, the relationship, it depends more on China now than it did before the Ukraine war. So if China has both Europe and the US where it wants it, it's splitting or, sowing division amongst the transatlantic partnership. China is now more dependent on it as it shifts to green energy, for example, with solar panels. What's the incentive to bring Russia to its senses?
Well, I think no matter what have been stated by Xi Jinping or the Chinese state media, the Chinese interest is now pretty much global, and China could not, back Russia for everything. China needs to develop its own,
strategic autonomy,
relationship with EU. And as a, if not counterweight, but as a part of a more multiple centered world.
So you actually see Macron's timing as being fortuitous?
The timing is probably not a terribly good news for EU, but or for the United States. But it gave Beijing a time and place to deal with this card. But I do not see a crack of US-EU transatlantic alliance.
Beijing has aspirations to be a global diplomatic player, indeed to replace the US. Along with the Macron and von der Leyen trip to Beijing, there was also representatives from Saudi Arabia and Iran also meeting in Beijing under the auspices of Xi Jinping. But in becoming this global diplomatic player, what does that mean? What are the implications of that for Beijing? Will it need to open itself up to more scrutiny?
Now, in bridging the re-establishment of the diplomatic relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a big breakthrough indeed. But I think I would say that it's gaining and regaining some shared power with the United States in Middle East. And we'll see how it goes, because I think that is something that we're all watching. It doesn't necessarily mean that, as you know, the Iranian officials diplomatically mentioned, that it's the end of the U.S. influence in the Middle East. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I think China is exercising and reinserting its power in various different places, including what you just mentioned, trying to mediate the peace talk between Ukraine and Russia. But we'll see how it goes.
Now, in July, Lithuania will host the NATO summit. Our next guest is Žygimantas Pavilionis, the chair of the Lithuanian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. He was the proponent of the resolution to invite Ukraine to join NATO in July, which was unanimously adopted by the Lithuanian Parliament. Here's an excerpt. The Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania says it affirms the following key goals of Lithuania. Number 2, to give full support to Ukraine, recognizing the necessity to invite Ukraine to join NATO at the NATO summit as a strategic solution by NATO to achieve peace in Ukraine and Europe. Žygimantas also called for the deepening cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific. I began by asking him about Emmanuel Macron's China visit. As a Lithuanian, how do you view the French deals and the large business delegation that Emmanuel Macron took with him to Beijing?
Stupid and naive, because thinking that they might overturn Chinese policies, this is very naive. And knowing the communists, because I was just 20 when we revolted against Soviet Communist Empire, knowing their psychology, I'm 100% sure that Chinese communist leader seeing that visit is just laughing, because he sees France kneeling. It's like, I would say even ugly, to shake hands with Chinese army, to have some deals that today supports Russia, to ask for Chinese intervention in creating peace. Under which terms? Mr. Macron, we saw a wonderful Sarkozy deal in Georgia that left Russian tanks in occupied territories. So do you want another deal like this? Are you not fed up with Minsk or other Yaltas and Munichs when you sacrifice the nations and people just because of your arrogance?
So it's interesting that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, accompanied Macron on this trip. What do you think about her position and things that, you know, she did have quite firm and pointed remarks to Beijing in a press conference of her own? She raised peace in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, honestly, I respect much more the role of the President of the Commission, von der Leyen, because she is the leader who made a lot of important strategic decisions, including she supported the candidate status for Ukraine, and we hope she will be the leader that extend invitation to start accession talks with Ukraine to enter the European Union. I was on the same train with Ursula von der Leyen to Bucha in April. I was one of the first visitors together with her. We saw those bodies of civilians from the mass grave with our own eyes, and I know that it changed the soul of Ursula. She was the one to put German soldiers to Lithuania, who are now #1 NATO force to safeguard our own freedom. And I really appreciate much more European Commission, because they really try us to speak in one voice. When China attacked us with sanctions, Commission immediately helped us and united all other EU member states behind us. They are now developing the mechanism that will stop economic coercion in the future.
Let me quote to you something that Joseph Borrell, the Vice President of the European Commission, said after the EU-China summit about a year ago. He said, "The purpose of foreign policy is shaping the choices of international players. This also applies to China, for the EU, the best way to do so is to be realistic, firm, and united. So can you tell me, how damaging is it that a nation, a leading EU nation like France, are they going completely contrary to the rest of the European Union? And where would you place Germany in this?
I would maybe then tell you another story from my life. In my previous incarnation, I was diplomat who negotiated my country's accession to EU and NATO. And I was deputy foreign minister 15 years ago at Bucharest NATO summit. Together with Bush the Jr. and other regional presidents, we demanded a so-called membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. We wanted Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. And we were vetoed, we were blocked by two nations, France and Germany, because they listened to what Mr. Putin said in Munich in 2007. He said, oh, NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia will be a provocation to me. I could even have a war with Ukraine and Georgia if you enlarge NATO to Georgia and Ukraine. And you know what? Germans and French kneeled in front of Putin in Bucharest. They appeased the dictator. And what happened then? Immediately when NATO showed the signs of weakness, in 2-3 months, the same Russia occupied Georgia. And we said then, together with my president Adamkus, next is Crimea, next is Ukraine. We said it in 2008. Everybody was thinking we are kind of crazy or so anti-Russian and damaged by Soviet occupation, but we were right. We knew the Russians. We lived with the Russians for 1,000 years. We know how to handle those, beasts who attack us and kill us. And now the same situation is happening in Vilnius. In 3 months, we have NATO summit. We are demanding NATO membership for Ukraine. We are demanding the West to make very clear red line to Russians, never ever occupy Ukraine. Because the moment we say to Russians, the war will stop. Because those communists and autocrats, they are attacking just the weakest chain. If we are strong, if we are united, nobody attacks us.
America, would they share your view on Ukraine joining NATO?
I was ambassador there 2010-15. And I know that country. So I would summarize like this. The wisest of Americans are with me. Those experts, those who speak truth, who are not afraid to speak truth. I would say half of Congress is with me. And this is becoming better and better with each of the visit. I cannot say that administration today is with me. And this is a pity, because I like this administration. I like President Biden. I was more or less crying when he made his inauguration speech about democracy being at the center of foreign policy agenda. But you know what, Mr. President, time is ticking. If we are not making the red line now for Russians in Ukraine, if we are not pushing them back, if we do not make a decisive defeat to Russia, if we do not give all the weapons that you have, including ATACMS, long-range artillery, planes, if you do not support them, if you do not accept them to NATO, so by the end of this year, this policy of yours will be defeated. And democracy might, for a long time, not to be at the center of American foreign policy. We might have isolationists winning in America in 24. So window of opportunity for global democracy is closing. We will all be in trouble. All, I mean all, in Taiwan Straits including. So please show that democracy can win. Please show that Ukrainians who deserve all our respect are winning. And China will listen. China will never attack Taiwan if we're winning together in Ukraine. But if not, you can also imagine another map of NATO countries of like Baltics or Poland attacked. You might imagine the Third World War starting. And
Americans have said since the start of the war that they cannot get involved, NATO cannot get involved, because then it would be the Third World War.
Well, war started. The problem is that those who started the war are much wiser. They do not call it war, but they attack us every day in gray zones, in invisible zones, and they make us accept those occupations. In Georgia, well, let's start annihilating Chechen nation in Russia. Hundreds of thousands killed, nobody noticed. Georgia occupied, nobody noticed. Even, big parts of Ukraine occupied. Well, still shaking hands with Putin. And we don't even remember 1/3 of Moldova occupied. We don't even remember the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan created by Russia. So a lot of wars. And actually it started in 40s. I have 4 kids. I am educated, free. I live the life and inspire others. Vilnius today is the center of Russian dissidents' most powerful group. Vilnius today is hosting the Belarusian freedom. We have a Belarusian president who won elections, but her elections were stolen, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Vilnius today is the only capital where we call Taiwan, Taiwan, because we know that freedom is not for granted. We know that if we are not investing today into freedom of others, tomorrow we die. So let's be wiser, and let's do not be afraid of defending freedom and democracy.
To discuss that interview, my next guest is Marcin Józefski, the Taiwan office head of European Values Center for Security Policy, and he's a Polish national. Marcin, so should NATO listen to Lithuania this time?
Per recent reports, Washington are trying to emphasize that in order for Ukraine to be able to fully participate in the collective security arrangements of NATO, we first have to ensure that it survives as a sovereign nation, and that's why Washington, London, also to some extent Berlin, Budapest are pushing within the alliance to prioritize deliveries of weapons to Ukraine rather than talking about a political pathway for accession.
But you say that this is political, but at the same time, why not simply accept them into NATO rather than continuing to send weapons?
Moscow, since the very beginning of full-scale invasion, has sought to frame the ongoing conflict as a war as inherently between Russia and NATO. And several NATO allies, including Washington, are actively avoiding playing into those dynamics.
We're aware of that, Marcin, but I guess the point that Zygmantas was making is that, despite listening to Russia in 2008, they still invaded Georgia, then they invaded Crimea. So does Zygmantas have a point?
He definitely has a point, but in every collective body, such as NATO, the key to decision-making is consensus. And there is more hesitation farther from the eastern boundary of NATO when it comes to the degree to which NATO should be involved in the conflict. And given the collective security nature of NATO's arrangement, bringing in Ukraine while the war is still raging in its full scale is unacceptable for some of the allies.
So they still think that is a provocation?
They want to avoid the perception that it is a further provocation of Moscow.
Okay, so on the other side, we had Emmanuel Macron, President of France, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, going to Beijing and hoping to get Xi's agreement to influence Putin, Vladimir Putin. Are you seeing any signs that they might be succeeding?
I believe that there aren't really signs of China being able to play a productive role as a peace broker in the current conflict, and I think that it is highly counterproductive to try to engage Beijing in such a role.
So you would agree with Zygmantas, and that is actually counterproductive?
Absolutely, I 100% agree with this statement, and I think that we have to bear in mind that even within the European Union, in countries like Lithuania, like Czechia, we are waking up to the reality where we see China as not only a strategic competitor, but also a source of corrosive capital, as a in many ways dangerous player, and corrosive capital and this kind of negative influence is the last thing that we need as we talk about a reconstruction of Ukraine following the war.
But why is that? I mean, the French would say that this is a perfect opportunity to basically call out Xi and say, okay, you want to be global peacemaker, do it.
I believe that something that is a source of concern about the way that France and previously the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have engaged with China is that there has been a very strong business component to those delegations. So we really cannot divorce the fact that Macron didn't travel to China by himself. He brought a sizable delegation of French entrepreneurs. So the real question here is whether the political message took priority during his delegation, or whether it was about continuing business as usual, or even letting Sino-French ties thrive in the business sector. So I don't think that the political message was as strong as the business one.
And maybe even, you seem to be saying, maybe even a cover for the business to basically go forward, as you said, with business as usual, which is a little bit strange, isn't it? Because Ursula von der Leyen did talk about reducing dependence on China, and that this was important for the EU. So she talked about de-risking, and yet Macron turned up with a 50-strong business delegation.
It's important that you bring our attention to this divergence in the kind of messages that were broadcasted by von der Leyen and by Macron during the recent trip to China, and I think that this is yet another instance in which we can see that engaging or trying to engage China in a resolution of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine is counterproductive, because it is not a new finding that China has been trying to apply a divide and conquer strategy when it comes to engaging Europe, and this trip has shown very clearly that Macron and von der Leyen were not speaking in a unified voice, which I think is very much to the detriment of the European outlook in the context of Brussels EU27 relations with Beijing.
So you think actually the trip highlighted very, very clearly the divisions, and also showed that she was exploiting those divisions?
Absolutely, and I think that those kind of divisions that exist between some of the largest and most influential in terms of population, for example, which translates into the number of seats in the European Parliament member states, is yet another cleavage where authoritarian actors such as Xi Jinping's environs that they can take advantage of.
Martin Józefski, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you so much for having me.